The studio courtroom fell into a reverent, almost sacred silence as Pastor Joel Osteen leaned forward at his gleaming pulpit-like desk, the atmosphere in the cavernous, highly produced broadcasting center suddenly shifting from a carefully curated atmosphere of corporate worship to an arena of unexpected, palpable tension. This was an environment meticulously designed for televised triumphs, a sparkling, pristine empire of the prosperity gospel where every camera angle, every soft lighting cue, and every perfectly timed musical swell was calculated to project an image of untouchable success, perpetual blessing, and polished performative religion. The lighting, usually designed to cast a warm, heavenly halo effect around the famous mega-pastor, now seemed to glare harshly against the stark contrast of the impending confrontation, illuminating the fundamentally different energies occupying the stage. Across from Osteen sat Jonathan Roumie, the actor universally recognized for his profound, authentic portrayal of Jesus, wearing a simple, unassuming jacket, his entire demeanor serving as a quiet, grounding counterweight to the gleaming, high-definition perfection of his host. The soft thud of his footsteps earlier as he had walked onto the expansive stage had been the very first subtle disruption in the usual highly choreographed routine of the broadcast, a quiet, authentic presence entering a space utterly dominated by ethereal, superficial promises of wealth and ease. Osteen, flashing his signature, incandescent million-dollar smile, a practiced veneer of perpetual victory that had graced 1,000 book covers, began his subtle, condescending interrogation, attempting to frame Roumie's profound global impact as mere performative faith, a temporary acting gig rather than a genuine, spiritually resonant calling. The pastor's voice, smooth as velvet and dripping with a patronizing sweetness, sought to undermine the actor, questioning the validity of finding true faith through a television screen while simultaneously and hypocritically elevating his own massive stadium sermons and multi-million-dollar corporate enterprise above the gritty, authentic portrayals of biblical suffering that Roumie embodied. It was a classic, manipulative trap, a rhetorical maneuver specifically designed to maintain the strict hierarchy of the megachurch platform, while diminishing the quiet, transformative grassroots ministry that Roumie had organically cultivated among the suffering, the forgotten, and the grieving. Osteen leaned heavily into his prosperity narrative, weaving a complex tapestry of words that subtly mocked the idea of embracing brokenness, suggesting instead that divine favor was exclusively measured by overflowing bank accounts, massive television ratings, and overflowing arenas, completely ignoring the profound despair of the marginalized who found deep solace in Roumie's empathetic, sorrowful performances. But Roumie did not take the bait, refusing to step into the snare of defensive argumentation. Instead, he sat in absolute stillness, embodying a quiet strength that began to systematically destabilize the polished, frenetic energy of the room. He did not raise his voice in righteous anger. He did not interrupt the pastor's flowing monologue, but his eyes held a profound, piercing sorrow that seemed to look right through the facade of the gleaming pulpit, piercing the hollow reality beneath the carefully curated empire. This was a breathtaking moment of spiritual jujitsu, where the aggressive, controlling energy of the interviewer was about to be effortlessly flipped by the sheer, undeniable weight of tangible truth. The live studio audience, composed of thousands of fiercely loyal followers accustomed to an unbroken diet of positivity, leaned in collectively, the usual murmurs of enthusiastic agreement suddenly replaced by a breathless, heavy silence, sensing collectively that a massive, historical reckoning was about to unfold on live television. Before the major confrontation escalates into an explosive revelation that would alter the landscape of modern ministry forever, we must pause and consider where we align ourselves in this battle for authenticity. If you believe that truth should be spoken with grace, and that quiet conviction is more powerful than polished performance, then this is just the beginning. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next reckoning. As the massive broadcasting camera zoomed in tightly on Roumie's unbothered, calm face, he reached down beside his chair with deliberate, unhurried movements, slowly retrieving a simple, worn manila folder that looked entirely and strikingly out of place in the ultra-modern, pristine television studio. The physical revelation of the folder and the mysterious contract held within it created an instantaneous, massive curiosity gap, a sudden, jarring pivot from abstract philosophical debate to the presentation of hard, tangible, devastating evidence. Roumie opened the folder, his hands perfectly steady, and the bright studio lights caught the sharp edges of the stark white paper inside, reflecting a blinding truth into the room. He looked directly, unflinchingly at Osteen, whose practiced, untouchable smile finally began to falter, the corners of his mouth twitching nervously as the terrifying realization dawned upon him that his insulated, billionaire status was suddenly incredibly vulnerable to the light of day. With a voice that was soft but carried the unmistakable heavy weight of a prophetic warning, Roumie began to speak about the deeply entrenched private incarceration industry, an unexpected, jarring, and dark topic that instantly shattered the comfortable, wealthy illusions of the surrounding prosperity gospel. He spoke passionately, yet calmly, of the systemic suffering of the marginalized, the deep, agonizing despair of broken families torn apart by a ruthless legal system that literally profited from human misery, and he masterfully contrasted this grim, bleeding reality with the superficial, hollow promises of unending financial wealth being broadcast from that very stage. The room shifted violently, the atmosphere turning from merely tense to completely suffocating as Roumie pulled a specific, heavily redacted document from the folder, revealing it to be a legally binding corporate contract that directly and inextricably tied Osteen's massive secretive holding company to a massive $2.3 million investment in Zion Reach, a notorious, ruthless conglomerate deeply embedded in the expansion of the private prison system. The collective gasp from the live audience was intensely audible, a sharp, ragged intake of breath that echoed terrifyingly through the cavernous studio as the horrific realization hit the crowd that the religious empire built entirely on positive thinking and divine financial favor was secretly, financially interwoven with the systemic suffering and incarceration of the broken and the forgotten. But Roumie was far from finished. He did not shout in triumph. He did not gloat over his trapped opponent. Instead, he methodically extracted and read aloud from a printed email, a damning internal communication from the Zion Reach vice president explicitly thanking Osteen's private financial team for their quiet, highly lucrative partnership. The reading of the actual email from the Zion Reach VP stripped away the last remaining desperate layers of plausible deniability, explicitly detailing how the megachurch's massive investment was directly funding the construction of new juvenile holding facilities in heavily impoverished, minority neighborhoods, exposing a breathtaking, sickening level of hypocrisy that left the audience in a stunned, weeping silence. To drive the devastating, heartbreaking reality home, Roumie then produced a single photograph from the bottom of the folder, a haunting, heartbreaking image of a 15-year-old boy sitting alone in a bleak, freezing concrete holding cell, his young face etched with an unbearable, ancient despair. A boy whose very incarceration was literally generating quarterly financial dividends for the megachurch's massive investment portfolio. The emotional reveal of this photograph was an absolute masterclass in showing rather than telling, utilizing devastating sensory storytelling to bypass all intellectual defenses and strike directly, fatally at the human conscience of everyone watching. Beside the photograph on the gleaming desk, Roumie gently placed a small, clear plastic bag containing a few stale, broken Ritz crackers, explaining softly that this was the exact meager ration the young boy had been given for a daily meal, providing a stark, physical, sickening contrast to the lavish, million-dollar television set they were currently sitting on. Osteen sat completely frozen, his eyes wide with panic, his carefully constructed, decades-old empire unraveling spectacularly before his very eyes, his pristine facade completely and permanently shattered by the undeniable visual and documentary evidence of his horrific complicity in systemic suffering. Roumie confronts the agonizing silence in the room not with a fiery vengeance, but with a deep, sorrowful grace, pivoting the conversation to explain his own quiet, relentless work in the shadows, detailing his deep, personal involvement in the Restoration Code, a grassroots, boots-on-the-ground initiative focused entirely on genuine rehabilitation, systemic mercy, and tangible grace for the formerly incarcerated. He detailed exactly how his own massive global platform, born entirely from portraying the ultimate historical symbol of sacrifice and love, was currently being utilized to build immense legislative leverage in Washington, pushing relentlessly for a comprehensive reentry initiative that had already miraculously garnered sweeping bipartisan support to systematically dismantle the very systems of profit-driven incarceration that Osteen's holding companies were secretly funding. This was the ultimate cinematic David versus Goliath framing come to life, the quiet, unassuming, deeply spiritual actor entirely dismantling the untouchable billionaire megapastor, not with loud shouting or performative outrage, but with undeniable receipts, heartbreaking photographs, and an unwavering, terrifying commitment to absolute truth. By the time the hour-long program finished airing to millions of stunned viewers, the entire cultural and religious landscape of the country had fundamentally and irreversibly shifted, the explosive clip of the calm confrontation spreading across the internet like an uncontrollable wildfire, sparking a massive, explosive public reaction that completely transcended typical celebrity gossip or religious debate. The fallout was instantaneous, brutal, and catastrophic for the megachurch brand, with mainstream media outlets globally picking up the incredible story within mere hours, splashing the intricate, damning details of the Zion Reach contract across international front pages, cable news tickers, and viral investigative segments. Social media platforms exploded with a tidal wave of righteous anger and indignation, millions upon millions of comments pouring in, expressing a profound, weeping empathy for the marginalized youth depicted in the photo, and a deep, visceral, unrelenting anger at the exposed, sickening hypocrisy of a wealthy religious leader secretly profiting from human despair and systemic bondage. The complete vindication of Roumie's stance through overwhelming social proof was staggering, as independent investigative journalists, high-profile legal experts, and even devastated former executive members of Osteen's own congregation stepped forward publicly to corroborate the systemic, shadowy financial maneuvers that had successfully kept the megachurch insulated from public and governmental scrutiny for decades. Within a matter of days, the explosive television revelation triggered a massive formal DOJ investigation into the murky, unregulated financial overlaps between tax-exempt religious organizations and the highly lucrative private incarceration industry, a systemic, terrifying reckoning that threatened to permanently destabilize the entire multi-billion-dollar prosperity gospel ecosystem. The unbelievable story quickly became a mandatory Harvard case study in catastrophic crisis management and profound moral failure, highlighting meticulously how a single, calm, thoroughly researched revelation could completely and utterly unravel a multi-million-dollar corporate religious entity in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie's public profile was unexpectedly and beautifully baptized in an entirely new, revered light. His massive platform elevated to unprecedented heights not by calculated self-promotion or PR teams, but by his fierce, undeniable willingness to risk his own lucrative acting career to speak absolute truth to untouchable power, to stand firmly and quietly in the gap for the grieving, the vulnerable, and the forgotten. His championed re-entry initiative saw an unprecedented, record-breaking influx of grassroots donations, high-profile endorsements, and passionate volunteer support, conclusively proving to the world that authentic, humble, sacrificial leadership resonates far more deeply in the human soul than polished, wealthy, performative religion ever could. The profound, unforgettable contrast between the highly produced, gleaming corporate environment of the megachurch and the gritty, heartbreaking concrete reality of the forgotten boy in the holding cell became the defining, indelible image of the decade, a stark, prophetic reminder to millions that true living faith is found not in the artificial absence of suffering or the accumulation of wealth, but in the courageous willingness to confront darkness head-on with undeniable proof and unyielding grace. As the cultural dust finally began to settle, and the once untouchable corporate empire of the prosperity gospel began to rapidly crumble under the crushing dual weight of severe federal scrutiny and massive public abandonment, the quiet, unshakable strength of Jonathan Roumie stood tall as a permanent historical testament to the enduring, world-changing power of the truth. If you believe that truth should be spoken with grace and that quiet conviction is more powerful than polished performance, then this is just the beginning. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next reckoning.